everybody, and I'm here to talk to you about Hamlet. If you see Mr. Cox, tell him how impressed you are with the flashing Hamlet here. He loves that. All right, so we're going to get into this. You might notice initially, I would definitely take notes as I'm going through this. I would notice initially like how this is oddly spelled. One of the things that sometimes we have trouble with when we're talking about Elizabethan English is that spelling in the writing as we know it isn't actually codified yet, so spelling does become a little looser than we're perhaps used to. You might notice the tragical spelled weirdly there, and the F in history. That F is actually an S sound. So don't worry too much about spelling and those kinds of things because it is a little fluid through here. So we're going to talk about Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark. So the setting of the play takes place in and around Denmark in the Castle of Elsinore. If you don't know where Denmark is, go ahead, Google it, pull up the map. It is towards the top of Europe, right below the hanging Scandinavian countries. Denmark and England have a very close working relationship because sometimes it's easier to get a boat across the North Sea to England than it is to go by land to anywhere, especially if you're talking about those countries that are at the top of the globe. So very close relationship between England and Denmark. But Denmark up there at the top of the globe. We're talking late Middle Ages here, 15th century, 16th century. This is an older story. Really what we're dealing with is this interesting moment in history where we are growing out of feudalistic ideas, feudalistic European ideas that the head of the manor sort of runs these individuals who live on his land but don't own the land, but they work for him. So it's not quite slavery, but very close to that in practice. They would have much more rights, but it was very limiting to the lower classes. So we're moving away from this sort of feudalistic idea into more of a Renaissance kind of idea that men have more rights, there's more going on, there's less of a connection to the land, you can be more middle class, you can be a trader. So we have this culture conflict here between what we have known so far in history and then the sort of new established society that we are creating, growing and developing. And we've seen this in our own society where we go from, the baby boomers, World War II era, mom and dad and white picket fence, and dad works and mom stays home, very sort of classic clean-cut images. That definitely changes into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts. As society changes and grows and develops, and you have that clash sometimes between an older culture that thinks we should do it one way and the younger culture that thinks the new way is better. We're essentially seeing that same thing here with an older established culture and a newer sort of strange progressive idea. So this is Kronborg Castle in Elsinore, Denmark. This is essentially what you should think of when you think of Elsinore. It's not a typical castle that we would think of with a giant wall and turrets and those kinds of things. It's much more modern. Sometimes we have a hard time with imagining events from the 15th, 16th, 17th century because we want to see them as medieval, with castles and knights and things like that, and that's not anachronistically correct. That's not time period correct. So yeah, it is a little bit more modern than what you're thinking of. In that same way, we have students that sometimes get a little lost or a little confused as to why Hamlet is going to be referencing guns or cannons or things like that. They do have firearms. They don't have firearms the way that we would think of them, but you have hand cannons, which you would literally hold, and almost like a bazooka kind of thing. You would hold it, somebody else would load it, and it would fire. They do have technology that we don't always consider because, again, we have a hard time pinpointing these moments in our history. We think, oh, Hamlet, medieval castles, and we're thinking knights and King Arthur and that whole 9 yards, and that is not what we're looking at. We're looking at something a lot more modern than we would usually perceive. Now, on that same note, Hamlet, and this is the stuff that you're going to want to write down because it's important to his character, Hamlet attends university. Like, he goes to the University of Wittenberg in Germany, which at this time is going to be an Ivy League education. It is the best, most expensive, most elite education a person can get. Very cutting edge, very progressive, very Renaissance, kind of very philosophical. So the University of Wittenberg is still a university that exists and established in 1502. He would have studied all sorts of things to be a sort of well-rounded individual. He would have studied Latin so he could read the classics. He would have studied rhetoric so that he could argue and write in that same sort of idea. He would have studied moral philosophy to become a much different kind of person than perhaps his father or later on his uncle. It's just like, it's akin to a student going away to college and learning a bunch of new ideas and coming home and realizing that the new information they have and the old information they were raised with, they have to sort of clarify and classify that within themselves. This education is moving away from this emphasis on church teachings, very bare bones kind of lessons, be good, do this, do that, to early Christian humanism. And the early church teachings that we're moving away from very much deal with this idea of the great chain of being, that God has put the king on the throne and that is his divine right and that is a divine mandate, and if you are critical of the king, you are thereby critical of God's choice and thereby critical of God. So that great chain of being going from God, Jesus, the king, his aristocratic individuals, the clergy, the common man, that way that works downward. We're moving away from that to this idea of early Christian humanism, where it's teaching more along the lines of that all men are capable, all men have a commonality to them that links them one to another. One human being may not necessarily be better than another human being. So we're making these tentative steps toward this idea that all humans are sort of equal in the divine sort of structure, and that maybe divine right isn't necessarily real. And so that is another clash that we're getting here, because all of the sitting monarchs, all of the kings and queens that are currently in power, it is in their best interest to emphasize divine right because it's keeping them in power, but that's not what the educated individuals of the day are talking about. That's the church is moving from that idea as well. A lot of the younger influences are moving to this idea of humanism. Like, let's look at each other as human beings, and there's an equality here, and there's a commonality, and that human achievement is wonderful and great, and maybe not necessarily a reward from God, but maybe a reward of your own hard work, which certainly that skill and that effort they would have attributed to God, to a divine source, but they also are looking at what they're doing. So it creates that tension between this feudalistic honor culture of I'm strong and I'm powerful and I'm wealthy and I'm rich and that's because God likes me, to this idea of moral philosophy of humanism, that I am a good person, that you are as good as I am, that I have the same abilities that you have, that I am equal in the eyes of God, that kind of idea. So a lot of tension, especially in classes. So your upper social class, it's in their best interest to continue the status quo, and the lower social classes and the sort of scholarly social classes, it's in their best interest to change the status quo. So this is that great chain of being that I was talking about a little bit earlier. As you can see, this is how it comes down. Very medieval, very old. Even at this point in time, it's passé. It's sort of old news to kind of think this, but definitely everybody in a position of power is still thinking this. And it is definitely the law of the land, because the king is the law of the land. So in Shakespeare's time, as you may have learned from your puzzles in your escape room, in Shakespeare's day, there were very strict laws governing the class system, because it was important that everybody was in their place and stayed in their place and did what they were supposed to do. So here we have the idea that the ruler's power is coming from God and that divine right. And under this system, the killing of a king was a gross violation. That is something that people would have believed would receive instant punishment from God in some kind of way. Like God would instantly show his displeasure if you removed a monarch that he appointed to the throne. And those disruptions occur in all sorts of ways. Nature goes out of order. We have signs, portents. In Macbeth, you have this image of these horses eating each other when the king is killed. In Julius Caesar, when Julius Caesar is killed, you have lions in the streets. You have a red, bloody comet going across the sky. All sorts of really scary, weird, unusual things happen. And the people would take this as a sign of God's displeasure, that somehow the great chain of being had been violated. Now, we're going to see that in Macbeth. Oh, sorry, not Macbeth. We're going to see that in Hamlet as well, that there is sudden natural disorder created upon the death of a monarch. So Hamlet, just to get into Hamlet in general here, Hamlet is what we refer to as a revenge tragedy. So yes, it is a tragedy, and it's a tragedy because it has a tragic hero, that's Hamlet. He has a tragic flaw, also known as hamartia. His tragic flaw is, we're going to decide that. We're going to talk about what his tragic flaw is. Typically, your tragic flaw in these kinds of things is pride. That's the most common tragic flaw. I'm not necessarily sure that's what we have here. Tragedies are also going to deal with issues of fate. They're going to be elements of the supernatural sort of mixed in. That works here because we do have a ghost. So that's our supernatural element here. And Hamlet does spend an awful long time talking about what is his fate, what is his destiny, what he should and should not do. In a tragedy, you have a downfall, you have a reversal of fortune. So Hamlet starts as a prince who has all of these possibilities ahead of him, and he doesn't necessarily end that way. And also in tragedies, you have a lot of characters that die. Like, if we're talking specifically about Hamlet, like a lot, don't get attached, like a lot of characters die in this play. Now, if we're talking about a revenge tragedy, which is the specific kind of tragedy that Hamlet is, revenge tragedies are exactly what they sound like. They are a tragedy, so you have all those things listed above, but they also have this call for revenge. So your main character, your tragic hero, is going to be called to revenge some sort of dastardly deed that has been done. And in this particular case, Hamlet's father has been killed. And so there's this call for vengeance to right this wrong because Hamlet's father, also called Hamlet, so King Hamlet, has been killed. And now it's Prince Hamlet's job to sort of do something about that. But what we see in these revenge tragedies is not cut and dry. It's not, oh, you killed my father, prepare to die. It is an expansion of violence where one bloody deed leads to another bloody deed, leads to another bloody deed, and you have this cyclical violence, this blood will have blood kind of scenario. Now, this is the map. I'm going to put this up here. I'll talk about it really, really quickly because the interactions are really important. These are basically all the characters that you have. And so when I say that don't get attached to these characters, I mean it. Don't get attached to these characters. If you're looking in the center there, that's Hamlet. He's obviously the main character. His mother is Gertrude, and Gertrude was obviously married to the previous king, who is there at the top left as the ghost. So the King Hamlet, Hamlet's dad, starts the play dead. He is already dead as we begin. And so Hamlet is obviously upset about that. Now, it so happens that Hamlet's mom has immediately married Hamlet's uncle. Not her brother, but her ex-husband's brother, her dead husband's brother. So you have this weird sort of family triangle where now Hamlet's uncle is also his stepdad. You have Polonius coming down from Claudius. You have Polonius. He's an advisor. He's not related to anybody in the royal family. He's an advisor. Then he has two children named Ophelia and Laertes. Ophelia may have some sort of romantic connection to Hamlet. They have some kind of relationship. The extent of that relationship is unclear. Then you have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. They are childhood friends of Hamlet. They show up to sort of figure out what's going on here. Horatio and Hamlet, right there on the left. Horatio is Hamlet's best friend. That is his ride or die. That is his, down for anything kind of like close bestie. Horatio is probably, he's not a commoner, but he's not an aristocrat. He's somewhere in that sort of upper middle class area. And then lastly, you have Fortinbras. Fortinbras he says it's cousins with Hamlet, but I don't necessarily believe that they are actual cousins. I think they are royal cousins in the way that all royal people say that they are connected in some kind of way, distantly. Fortinbras is the Prince of Norway, not Denmark. So Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark, Fortinbras is the Prince of Norway. And that's going to matter because Norway and Denmark have been at war, I mean, for a real long time. There's still are issues between Norway and Denmark because they are so close to one another. So there are a couple questions that we get from time to time with Hamlet, like how old is Hamlet? Why is Hamlet not the king? How long does the play take? So a couple really quick ways to answer that is, how old is Hamlet? If we're going by the story, it seems like Hamlet is a young man, somewhere in his late teens, early 20s, maybe 16 to 20 something. It's very hard to tell. He has been at college, so he is older, but would probably be somewhere in his late teens, early 20s. There are a couple of lines and jokes sort of in the play a little later that joke about him being older than that. And the very real reason for that is when in Shakespeare's day, when they put this play on, your best actor would have to be Hamlet. And oftentimes your best actor is not going to look 16, 17, 18, 19. He's going to look older. So they would be pretending to be a younger person. And so there are a couple of jokes written in about, how old Hamlet looks. If we're going by the story, he's supposed to be a young man. If we're going by what is actually written, he could be anywhere between 15 and 34. Like, it's old. Why is Hamlet not the king? There's a lot of reasons for that. So Hamlet's dad dies. Hamlet does not become the king. His uncle becomes king. There's different ways of inheriting leadership in the world. We don't always go king's son as your leadership. Sometimes you go with the oldest male relative. Sometimes the leader is elected from a pool of candidates. And very simply, it could be that Claudius, the uncle here, has sort of maneuvered to get himself chosen here as king. How long does the play take? More than 6 months, less than a year. It's kind of hard. Time becomes kind of mushy in some places. Should Hamlet trust the ghost? Well, we're going to get into this conversation about there is a ghost, and the ghost does show up, and the ghost gives Hamlet some commands. And I don't know about you, but I think you should definitely fact check any kind of ghosts that are giving you any kind of ultimatums on things. Is the ghost real? That's another really good question, because it does seem like some people see the ghost, and then Hamlet sees the ghost, and then no one else but Hamlet sees the ghost. Does Hamlet love Ophelia? Why is he so mean? That's another good question. What is the nature of their relationship? And then he does become incredibly cruel to her throughout the rest of the play. And it sort of shines light on why is he doing this? What is his motivations? Did he actually ever care for her? It does seem at times like he does, but he is so mean to her. Hamlet's language. So Hamlet's language is one of the sort of defining characteristics of him. Hamlet is a speaker. He has got what my grandmama would refer to as a fast mouth. Like, he speaks so quickly, his insults and his language comes so fast. He is the smartest guy in the room. He uses his language to sort of wrestle with ideas, big ideas about life, the universe, everything, little ideas about who and what and where he should and shouldn't do. His language, though, does not make him feel better. So the more he wrestles with these philosophical ideas in his own brain, the less peace he's actually obtaining. It's like he works himself up. The more he argues, the more he pontificates, the more he discusses, the more anxious and edgy he becomes. He does also use his language as a shield to protect himself from interacting with the other people in the world. Sometimes he does this as nonsense, and he'll just word vomit nonsense at people to get them to think that he's crazy. Sometimes he insults them and gets them to walk away. Sometimes he confuses them and gets them to wander away. But he uses his language to distance himself from others. He also uses it to lash out verbally. He uses his language like a weapon. We see this especially with Hamlet versus Polonius, that advisor figure, and Hamlet versus Ophelia, this sort of former lover. And I think when he lashes out verbally, we see sort of a truth of Hamlet. I think we see his heart there a little bit, because to be angry at a person, you have to have feelings originally. He uses very revolting image, very sexual images at times. He is trying to offend. He is trying to bother people. He is trying to be disgusting. And so oftentimes he is successful on that. He uses a lot of slang. He uses a lot of puns. The joke I always tell my students is if Hamlet says something, he's actually saying two things, sometimes three, but you need to figure out what two things he's saying, because when one sentence he says two things. So be careful that the thing he says might not always be the thing that he means. He is a prince and he is a politician, and he's what we refer to as Machiavellian. So The Prince is a book written by Nicholas Machiavelli out of Italy, and it's basically a handbook on how to rule effectively. A lot of that is, hey, do this, do that, but it boils down essentially to make them fear you. That's a good motive. So a lot of Machiavellianism is this dance between what is and isn't acceptable, and how do you get your population, how do you manipulate your population? There's a lot of constant eavesdropping in this play. Everybody's listening to everybody else have a conversation. There's a lot of scheming. Claudius, the king, is scheming. Polonius, the advisor, is scheming. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the friends, are scheming. Hamlet's scheming. Everybody's scheming. Fortinbras, the Prince of Norway, is scheming. Everybody's got plans within plans within plans. We see this best with Polonius, who thinks that he is like this master spy, and in actuality, he is an idiot. Claudius uses murder and deception to gain power. Claudius becomes king instead of Hamlet, and the country seems very happy with that because, you know, he talks really well. He seems to be an effective leader in many situations. And don't get used to women mattering at all in this play. Women do not matter in this play. They are pawns in a political game. Gertrude and Ophelia are your two female characters here, and they are basically just maneuvered around this political chessboard without any, you know, concern for what they think or feel. This is the slide on Machiavelli. If you want to know more about Machiavelli, this is here. You can definitely look at that. But Machiavelli is all about that cunning, that deception, and that lying sometimes to get what you want is an appropriate way of doing that. Moving into Hamlet's language, I am going to pause just very briefly. 1 second. All right, sorry, I'm waiting on my kid to get out. So if we're talking about Hamlet's language here, one of the things that people often get caught up on when we talk about Shakespeare is they go, oh, Old English. I'm going to give you a whole rundown a little bit later, but Shakespearean English isn't Old English. Shakespearean English is early modern English, so it is the language that we speak. You wouldn't understand Old English. It sounds much more German than what you would used to. You wouldn't understand any of it. You might understand a few words from Middle English, but not enough to do anything with. You understand most of the words in Shakespearean English, this early modern English. One of the big differences is that contemporary modern English only really has those two pronouns, the you, your, yourself. We don't have like a formal you, you know, like in Spanish they have usted, and French does that as well. But we used to have a formal and an informal second person pronoun. We no longer do. We dropped it because it's awful. But English is always about trying to streamline its language. But in Shakespeare's time, they did still have this differentiation between a formal you and an informal you. So you, Y-O-U, that we are used to, is actually the formal word. We kept the most polite version of the word. So you would hear your majesty, or you are more lovely than the sun. That is a very formal, polite way of speaking. The informal version would be the thou, the thee, the thine, those kinds of things. And you can see this sort of listed there. Thou just means you, but it's that informal. Thee just means you, but it's that informal. And then thine would be like yours, that kind of thing. The opposite of mine, essentially. Mine and thine. So don't get too caught up. When you see those words, it's just you. It's just your. So the very last thing that we're going to talk about here is the characters that do survive. And so we'll talk about this a little bit when you come back to class, so that we can sort of have that discussion. But what I want you to know, and sort of the last thing in your notes here, is before the play begins, because we start this play in medias res, which means in the middle of things. So there's a little bit of history you need to know before you can jump into this story with the rest of us. So one of the confusing things that we do here is that kings often have the same names as their sons, and then occasionally they are just called by the country they rule. So you can see that here in Fortinbras 1, he's called Old Norway. He was King Fortinbras the First, Old Norway, lost a battle to Hamlet's dad, King Hamlet of Denmark. They had beef, they fought, Fortinbras lost, and he lost land. So Norway hasn't really gotten over this. Hamlet, Prince Hamlet, that the play is about, and Laertes are being schooled abroad, which means they are not in Denmark. Hamlet is in Germany, Laertes is in France. When King Hamlet, Hamlet I, dies, Claudius becomes king. Less than a month later, Claudius marries Gertrude, which is the former queen and also Hamlet's mom. Prince Fortinbras of Norway, the son of Fortinbras, Old Norway, Prince Fortinbras, now sends a letter demanding Claudius return those lands that his dad lost to King Hamlet in that original battle. Claudius denies that. He says, no, I'm not giving you lands back. You little whippersnapper, go away. And he prepares for this war. So really what you need to know is that there are 3 sons in this play: Fortinbras, Prince Fortinbras, Prince Hamlet, and Laertes. And there are 3 fathers in this play: King Fortinbras, Old Norway, King Hamlet, the Great Dane, sometimes they call him the Dane, and Polonius. So 3 fathers, 3 sons, and there's interactions between these ideas. So we have a lot of discussion about familial obligation, like what is your obligation to your family, what is a lineage, what is a legacy, what is wrong, what is right, what do we do about cyclical generational violence? Just because my dad did something to your dad doesn't mean that I am to be punished for that. Doesn't mean you get to do something mean to me. This idea is about where does it stop? And again, we go back to that concept, that old feudal custom, that would have just happened. Your dad killed my dad, I'm going to kill you. Then your kid will come around to kill me. Like, it's just a cyclical generational violence. But the new sort of humanistic way is like, hey, we're all our own people, and just because my dad was a jerk and killed your dad doesn't necessarily mean that that's my fault. So there's a lot of different ideas culturally that are growing here that this play sort of deals with and develops about right and wrong and family and obligation and lineage and legacy and honor. All right, we're going to talk more about this. It's a lot, I understand. Good luck.